So everybody's freaking out about this incoming winter, this oncoming and incoming winter. This incoming winter is coming up because of energy cost and everything's more expensive because goddamn Putin wants to fucking invade a sovereign nation, and now the entire world has to, stand up and do what's right, so we might be prepared to go through a winter war. And it makes me think of the winter war between the Soviet Union and Finland. So Russia has invaded Finland before. In fact, they won. They wound up taking 9% of Finland. So when Russia invaded Finland, they got 9%. So is that what's going to happen with Ukraine? Every time Russia invades a country, they just take 9%. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Winter War, but it makes me think of a Winter War. There's a movie called A Winter War, Valley Forge. I'm more familiar with Valley Forge, and it is as bad as they say it is. It's actually worse in some respects, but it's not as bad in other respects. So there was like super cold winters that had happened in the revolution. It was basically a typical winter, but 2,000 people had died, not just due to cold, but starvation and disease. So it was a travesty. It was George Washington and the American army, the ragtag American army, getting their asses kicked. And they're like, well, shit, we're just going to hunker down over here for a while, for a bit, for this winter. And then hopefully the American Revolution is going to last from, 76 to 83, right? That's the Paris Agreement. So from 76 to that's 7 years. But the Battle of York, is that the final one? That's, 81? So that's going to be 5 years from now. It's going to be, 3 or 4 years. So this war is still, the American Revolution is still going on. We're fighting for our Bill of Rights eventually. They didn't have the Bill of Rights in the beginning, but the Constitution, elections, we have a right for the consent of the governed. I'm tired of the damn king telling us what to do. Taxation without representation, a tea tax, a stamp tax, every tax in the world. Too many taxes. So I'm thinking of the Winter War, because there's going to be a Winter War. And then I'm also thinking of World War II, how the mobilization efforts of World War II included everybody, anybody and everybody. I'm also thinking about different ways of staying warm. So when it comes to this involvement with Ukraine, we're spending billions of dollars. America is spending billions of dollars to, stand up for what's right. But the quicker we bring this war to an end, the better for everybody. So I'm just saying we might have to hunker down, not just the troops, in Poland or Estonia, or wherever they're at. They're by the wayside, flanking, but the American people too. Valley Forge, Revolutionary War, that's America v. England. World War I, it was the socks that they needed the most of. They kept running out of socks. They didn't have enough clean socks. They also had to ration their sausage. They'd have like a third of a sausage every day. The mobilization efforts of World War II was, fantastic. They would have, not only like women would go into the factories or women were getting jobs. And then raising victory gardens. Everybody was doing their part. So, they're going to need the food in the front lines. We're going to need to raise as much food as we can for ourselves. So that way we're not, taking the food, sending supplies to them. Everybody was involved. If you weren't over there fighting overseas, you were at home doing something. Victory gardens, right? So just raising a garden, in the alleyway in your little tiny plot up on the rooftop, just maybe outside your window. Wherever you can. Do your part. So a couple ideas about how to stay warm for winter. If you move your body, 80% of your body temperature, of your heat, goes out of your head. So wearing a hat, a balgan especially, 80%. And then the other body temperature comes from your muscles. I heard 40%, that adds up to 120%. So that's just, a guesstimate. But that's where your body temperature is. Your body temperature is in your muscles, and it's in your head. And 80%, 40%. So get those muscles moving. Get them muscles moving, right? Dance in the room, get the air temperature up. Try to weatherize the place. Try to make it to where it's airtight. There's something about open the window at the end of the house just slightly. So that way you get the heat. If you have a stove, then you get the heat, then you get this draft, which I thought it was actually fucking brilliant. It also helps with the quality of air. Get a nice sleeping bag. Layers, layers and layers. So 1, 2, 3, 4 pants, 5, 6, 7, 8 shirts, and 22 socks and 55 balgans. Insulation. Spend time and sleep in the upper levels of the house. Heat rises. Heat rises. So the second, third, fourth floor. Moving your working, sleeping, and living spaces upward may be more comfortable. Headbands, balgans. And then think about your phalanges, your ears. Those are the things that's going to be most susceptible to frostbite. So make sure they stay warm. Sometimes I can get everything warm, but my hands, just having one of those hand warmers. One of these hand warmers right here. These hot hands are pretty nice. Sometimes I just have a heater just to heat up my hands. And you save a lot of energy without having to do a heater. Just, you open this thing up and I don't even know how it works, but you just rub it together and it activates with the air within 10, 15 minutes. It's pretty warm. So I'm not for sure what the contents: iron, water, vermiculite, charcoal, polymer, and salt. Probably that vermiculite, huh? It's probably that vermiculite. So those are some ideas to stay warm. Of course, friction. And then, putting your hands, I find on the back of my neck. So, Valley Forge. This is December 1777 to June. So they were there from the winter of 77 to 78. In December, I heard there was like a battle in the very beginning. And then they got their asses kicked. Americans got their asses kicked. And then everybody came and set up shop. So I guess we won overall because we took Valley Forge, right? But the original... So at Valley Forge, the Continental struggled to manage a disastrous supply crisis while retraining and reorganizing their units. About 1,700 to 2,000 soldiers died from disease, exacerbated by the cold and malnutrition. There's a historical park today that preserves over 3,500 acres of the original encampment site. So I feel like it's just a tent city. It was George Washington's tent city. That's his regular unit, regular soldiers. And there was slaves there. It was like a mixture of everybody. But there were free men and apparently slaves are there and immigrants and a whole bunch of just ragtag everybody. And then in February, they're going to have to dismiss about 2,000 soldiers because they didn't have enough clothes. A lack of clothing, he had to send them home. So I'm sure, not just disease, but malnutrition, freezing. One of the immediate remedies against the weather and lack of clothing was the construction of log shelters by the men, building housing. This is what we're going to do in World War II also. You have all these soldiers, and in World War I, the American soldier could go to Europe, and there was housing that was in Europe, and so the housing was next to the battlefield, so that we didn't have to worry about providing the housing to the soldiers. But when we had our own soldiers here that need to be called upon for World War II, we had to build housing. We needed housing there. We needed housing here. And so it was actually one of the most incredible mass mobilization efforts of massive house building that I've ever heard of. It was like 1-2 million, houses were being built every year. And it wasn't just the soldiers, soldiers building houses for others. They were building their own houses too. And so that's, when it's within their own self-interest, here, this is your house. And they bragged about building a house one house every hour. They were able to build one house per hour. Which that's pretty incredible, is it not? Valley Forge was the first winter encampment. Many thousands of men had to build their own huts. The officers formed the men into construction squads, instructed them to build cabins according to a 14-foot by 16-foot model. George Washington said all the huts had to be 14 by 16 foot. Why, George? Why not 10 by 10? Make it a nice simple 10 by 10. The army placed the 2,000-odd huts in parallel lines, and according to one officer, the camp had the appearance of a little city when viewed from a distance. Most agreed that their log accommodations were tolerably comfortable. So, there was a super-ass cold. It was a winter. 2,000 people died. That's fucking crazy, right? I mean, how many... So, it was tough. Don't get me wrong. But the myth is that it was like the worst ever, but the bound and determined, and then we were successful. I mean, basically, we just stayed there and died. And then, there was another battle, and we lost the battle, but we're told that we were confident. I can understand solidarity. You go through some shit. You go to a cold-ass fucking mountaintop. You had to fucking survive a tough-ass fucking winter. Crazy shit happened. And then you come out the other end, and you're still, a strong fighting cohesive force. Only now you're just that much more battle ready, battle tested, now you're a veteran. Now you know what it's like to taste the sting of battle. And you're ready to fight as a better cohesive whole. I can, as a better cohesive whole. I can understand that. So the Winter War. This is Finland. I mean, what's going on right now with NATO and Finland and, the Russia today is incredible. You got motherfucking, Chomsky saying that they shouldn't provoke Russia by joining NATO, but what the fuck? Finland's just supposed to sit there without any alliances whatsoever and wait for someone. And then they, basically took on the Soviet Union by themselves. And for 2 months, they were able to... They actually, they killed a lot of, of the Soviets. They killed a lot of the Russian invaders. They might have got the victory at the end, but it wasn't without a major cost. So the Winter War is also known as the First Soviet-Finnish War. It's a war between the Soviet Union and Finland. The war began with the Soviet invasion of Finland on November 30th, 1939, 3 months after the outbreak of World War II, ended 3.5 months later with the Moscow Peace Treaty on March 13th, 1940. Despite superior military strength, especially in tanks and aircraft, the Soviet Union suffered severe losses and initially made little headway. The League of Nations deemed the attack illegal and expelled the Soviet Union from the organization. The Soviets made several demands, including that Finland cede substantial border territories in exchange for land elsewhere, claiming security reasons, primarily the protection of Leningrad from the Finnish border. They were 20 miles from the Finnish border when Finland refused. The Soviets invaded. Wow, okay. So now we're going to take your land because we think you're going to come into Leningrad. Most sources conclude that the Soviet Union had intended to take all of Finland and use the establishment of the puppet Finnish communist government and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact secret protocols as evidence of this, while other sources argue against the idea of full conquest. Finland repelled Soviet attacks for more than 2 months and inflicted substantial losses on the invaders, while temperatures... Putin makes no bones about it. He's clear as day. He thinks Ukraine is Russia. Temperatures range as low as negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which is negative 43 degrees Celsius. It's almost the same. 44, I guess, right? The battles focused mainly on Taipale along the Karelian Isthmus, on Kola in Ladoga, Karelia, and on battles focused mainly and on Rate Road in Kanu, but there were also battles in Sala and Petsamo in Lapland. After the Soviet military reorganized and adopted different tactics, they renewed their offensive in February and overcame Finnish defenses. Hostilities ceased in March 1940 with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, in which Finland ceded 9% of its territory. 9%. Soviet losses were heavy and the country's international reputation suffered. Their gains exceeded their pre-war demands, and the Soviets received substantial territories along Lake Ladoga. And for the further north, Finland retained its sovereignty, enhanced its international reputation. The poor performance of the Red Army encouraged German Chancellor Adolf Hitler to believe that an attack on the Soviet Union would be successful, and confirmed negative Western opinions of the Soviet military. After 15 months of interim peace in June 1941, Germany commenced Operation Barbarossa and the continuation war between Finland and the Soviets began. Wow! The continuation war. I don't know. So Germany invades. Germany invades the Soviet Russia, and Finland was on the side of the Nazis. In your enemy's enemy is your friend, kind of thing. To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet, and almost as often without provisions as with marching through frost and snow, and at Christmas taking up their winter quarters, without a day's march of the enemy, without a house or hut to cover them till they could be built, and submitting to it without a murmur. Wow, George Washington on Valley Forge. It's pretty fucked up. What you got? Yeah, I'm here to fight. I'm here to fight for the American Revolution. Yes, sirree. Johnny War Drums here. Here to fight for the American Revolution. What you got for me, George Washington? You got a gun or a uniform? How about a sword? How about just an axe? Hatchet? Butter knife? A stick that I can make a shank out of? Yes, good. All right, where's the stick at? Up your ass. Yeah, I know, George Washington. Why don't you get that stick out your ass? So George Washington had a 6-month encampment. He's losing the war, so he's like, man, we just gotta, we're just going to camp out over here and just try to, concentrate our forces and hold up our resources and get our, batteries recharged. Instead, 2,000 are going to die. While conditions are notoriously cold and harsh, it was at the winter camp where George Washington proved his mettle. You had von Steuben was there. Good old von Steuben, the Prussian military officer, transformed a battered Continental Army into a unified world-class fighting force capable of beating the British. September 18th, 1777, General Wilhelm von Knyphausen led British soldiers on a raid of Valley Forge, where American troops had built a handful of storage facilities. Defending the site were Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton and Captain Henry Light Horse Harry Lee. The British succeeded in stealing supplies and burning a few buildings. This minor skirmish later became known as the Battle of Valley Forge. A few months later, Washington and thousands of his troops would arrive at the site. Where is Valley Forge? Eastern Pennsylvania, along the banks of the Schuylkill River, 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. 6 days before Christmas in 1777 is when Washington set up Valley Forge. The men were hungry, tired, after a string of losing battles that had resulted in the British capture of the Patriot capital, Philadelphia, earlier in the fall at the Battle of Brandywine. The string of humiliating defeats led to some of the members of the Continental Congress to want to replace George Washington, believing he was incompetent. The Valley Forge winter camp site was about a day's march from British-occupied Philadelphia. Most of the land had previously been cleared for agriculture, leaving a level plateau in an open, rolling landscape. Washington picked the spot because it was close enough to keep an eye on British troops sheltering in Philadelphia, yet far enough away to prevent a surprise attack on his own Continental Army. Washington and his men would remain at the camp for approximately 6 months, from December 1777 until June 1778. Winter at Valley Forge. Within days of arriving at Valley Forge, troops constructed 1,500 to 2,000 log huts and parallel lines that would house 12,000 soldiers and 400 women and children throughout the winter. Washington directed that each hut measure approximately 14 by 16 feet. Sometimes the soldiers' families joined them in this space as well. Soldiers were instructed to search the countryside for straw to use as bedding. They weren't just looking the country. Apparently, they raided the countryside. They raided the people's houses and stuff when they were starving and everything was terrible. So they were not nice to the local homesteaders. Soldiers were instructed. That's why, soldiers can't quarter in your house. Soldiers were instructed to search the countryside for straw to use as bedding. Straw. There were not enough blankets for everyone. In addition to the huts, the men built miles of trenches and military roads and paths. One officer said the camp had the appearance of a little city. When viewed from a distance, George Washington and his closest aides lived in a 2-story stone house near Valley Forge Creek. So he had a nice 2-story stone house. Well, I'm going to stay in this 2-story stone house. You all go sleep in the mud outside. Right there in the swamp. Yeah, right there in the swamp with the flies and the alligators. Yeah, while the winter of 77-78 wasn't exceptionally cold, many soldiers lacked proper clothing, which left them unfit to serve. Some were even shoeless, like shoeless Joe Jackson, as George Washington described in December 23rd, 1777 letter to Henry Lawrence. We have by a field return this day made no less than 2898 men now in camp unfit for duty because they were barefoot and otherwise naked. 3,000 men had to, guys, all the naked guys, you need to go home. I appreciate the passion. I'm glad that you want to fight for the cause. You don't have any clothes. You lost your shoes. You lost your socks. You don't have a shirt or pants. And now you don't have any underwear. You're just sitting there naked in the mud, in the swamp, letting the eyes, the Army records suggest that each soldier received a daily ration of 1/2 pound of beef during January 1778, but food shortages during February left the men without meat for several days at a time. Disease at Valley Forge. Cold and starvation at Valley Forge were not even the most dangerous threats. Diseases proved to be the biggest killers. Disease. By the end of the six-month encampment, which is what they say about the Native Americans, so I guess the white man got a taste of his own medicine. Disease. By the end of the 6-month encampment, used to be 100 million people here. Some 2,000 men, roughly 1 in 6. The Native American genocide, one of the worst, died of disease. Camp records indicate 2/3 of deaths happened during the warmer months of March. Crazy. In April and May, when soldiers were less confined to their cabins and food and other supplies were more abundant. So the most common illness was the flu, influenza, typhus, typhoid fever, and dysentery, which is the exploding watery diarrhea disease. Bloody diarrhea. That's what dysentery is. So the flu, typhus, typhoid fever, and dysentery, conditions most likely exacerbated by poor hygiene and sanitation at the camp. Battle of Monmoth. The British soon tested the Continental Army's newfound discipline at the Battle of Monmoth, which took place in New Jersey, June 28th, 1778. Many historians consider the Battle of Monmouth a tactical draw. The Continental Army fought for the first time as a cohesive unit, showing a new level of confidence. The Americans used artillery to hold off British troops and even launched bayonet counterattack skills they had sharpened while drilling under von Steuben at Valley Forge. In the old days, writes archivist and author John Buchanan, the Continentals probably would have fled, but as Wayne Bottle writes in the Valley Forge Winter, civilians and soldiers in war, after 6 months of training in the mud and snow of Valley Forge, Washington's troops became imbued with a deeper identification with and pride in their craft. The Continental Army left Valley Forge for good. June 1778. Today, the site is home of the Valley Forge National Historical Park. In the fall of 1939, 2 years before our nation officially entered the war, the U.S. Army was comprised of only 200,000 enlisted soldiers. There was little need for new or updated housing. Beginning in 1940, the military started drafting men into the Army and Navy, and military ranks began to swell as hundreds of thousands of draftees, all of them who had to be housed, entered into the service. Within just 5 years, the Army had risen to the challenge, and they built themselves enough temporary, permanent military housing for all of its members, every one of its soldiers. A total of nearly 6 million men got their houses built by 1944. So in the span of 5 years, over 5 million houses were built. 1 million houses per year. That's incredible. And it makes sense. Okay, here, I'll give you the money and the supplies, build your own house. My God, how quick would houses go up when you do something like that? Army records of the food shipped to camp in the month of January 1778 revealed that the men received average daily rations of 1/2 pound of beef per man. The most serious food crisis occurred in February when the men went without meat for several days at a stretch. Shortages of clothing did cause severe hardship for a number of men, but many soldiers had a full uniform. At the worst point in early March, the Army listed 2,898 men as unfit for duty due to a lack of clothing. During this time, well-equipped units took the place of their poorly dressed comrades and patrolled, foraged, and defended the camp. Victory Gardens! The Selective Service Act passed in September 1940 specifically stipulated that no soldiers could be sworn into service until the government had made adequate provisions for their shelter. The military realities of World War II were vastly different than those of the Great War. During World War I, American soldiers were transported to France, where they were housed and trained at European posts close to the battlefields. But by 1940, Germany had occupied most of Europe, leaving England as the only country available to host American troops because England had only limited space to house, maintain, and train American soldiers. Transporting partially trained American soldiers overseas was no longer an available option. For the first time, the War Department needed to accommodate a substantial standing army that would be stationed in the U.S. indefinitely, and they kept coming in response to the growing threat in Europe. 400,000 men had enlisted by November 1940, and by February 1940, another 700,000 had joined them. The Army needed immediate plans for accommodation. Construction took place at breakneck speed as a result of readily available labor resources and ingenuity with building materials. Construction crews at Fort Ord in Monterey, California, boasted that they could finish a building every 54 minutes. By June 1941, the Army had built housing for 1.2 million men. By June 1942, they were able to accommodate 2.4 million men, and by January 1943, 4.6 million men were housed within these wood frame buildings. On December 19th, 1777, 12,000 soldiers, 400 women and children marched into Valley Forge and began to build what was essentially the fourth largest city in the colonies at the time, with 1,500 log huts and 2 miles of fortifications. Valley Forge was the fourth largest city at the time, and it was made up of free and enslaved African American soldiers, civilians, indigenous people, wealthy officers, impoverished European immigrants, speakers of several languages, and adherents of multiple religions. Concentrating the soldiers in one vast camp allowed the Army to protect the countryside and be better able to resist a British attack, but it became costly, and the lack of supplies and hunger afflicted the inhabitants, and diseases like influenza and typhoid and dysentery and typhus spread through the camp. While there was never a battle at Valley Forge, disease killed nearly 2,000 people during the encampment. We need to train our troops in Alaska. How cold does it get in Ukraine? We need to make sure we are ready to fight. I mean, you saw nobody wins in Russia, so you can't win a land war. You cannot think you can invade Russia in the wintertime, especially. Not by marching just right from Europe on over. You'd have to do something completely different. In France and Russia, people would sleep for many hours of the day when winter hit. The civil servant who was in Burgundy in the winter of 1844 wrote that the men, they would spend their days in bed, packing their bodies tightly together in order to stay warm and to eat less food. The citizens of the French Alps would hibernate with their cows and pigs during the winter months. A similar occurrence was taking place in Russia. The British Medical Journal reported in 1900 that peasants in the country's Pskov region would sleep for 1/2 of the year. According to the report, once a day the peasants would get up, eat a hard piece of bread, and take turns to make sure the fire was keeping them warm was still lit. In the U.S., the Sioux would survive harsh winters in South Dakota by storing food like dried meat, corn, beans, and potatoes. In the U.S. during the 1700s, wealthy people had fireplaces in every room of their homes. Simpler houses would have one big fireplace made of brick or stone that people could walk into. Stratford Hall, a mansion on the Potomac, boasted a fireplace that was 12 feet wide, roomy enough to fit an entire ox. Some of the early fireplaces required logs so big that they had to be dragged into the house with a horse and chain. Wear some layers.